What's up guys, we're going to do a how-to video on how to install fender flares specifically for the Datsun S30 chassis. This is my buddy's car. He's got a G-nose on it, and we're going to put on some Marugen ZG flares. These are standard size flares, and they're going to go on this car right here. So the first step that I do when installing flares is I like to mark a hole perfectly in the center of where the bolt is going on the flare. So if you take this flare, for example, I'll take my Sharpie and I'll try to get it right in the center of this area. So let's say right about there. And that's where I'm going to drill a pilot hole. And I'm going to go and do it on each one of these. There's 6 per flare. I'm going to drill my pilot hole. After I drill the pilot hole, I'm going to fit it to the car, and I'm going to mark with the Sharpie in each one of those pilot holes. Alright, so figuring out the placement of your flare. What I like to do is I tend to look at multiple S30 chassis cars with fender flares, and I kind of find out which one looks the best to me. Also, which ones are running almost the same wheel and tire setup as me, so I can just get an idea of exactly where I want to place the flare. Another way you can do it is you can lower your car to where you want your ride height to be, and then you would place your flare according to your tire, you know, where you want it. With this car, we're going to almost do an OEM placement with these flares as if it was a Japanese modeled ZG. And I've looked at, many actual ZG cars and figured out, how far away is the flare from the front bumper, from the turn signal there, where does it touch at the lower fender. And it's not going to be 100% exactly the same as the other cars that you look at. And they're probably not all the same from each other at the same time. So you can kind of freestyle a little bit and put it how you'd like. Why I specifically like these flares, this brand Marugen, is they are as close as possible to the original Nissan factory ZG flares. They have a curve in them that is molded to the body of the fender, and that is for the front and back too. So you can kind of see that bend in it right along the body line. So you can find the placement on these flares and these fenders pretty easily. So after I pilot hole the flare, I then mock it up to exactly where I want it placed. I'll then Sharpie one hole that I know does not move when it's naturally put on the fender, and I'll drill out that hole. First, I'll do a pilot hole. Then I'm going to drill to the size of the actual riv nut. So the riv nut should fit pretty snug with the body. Now I'm going to get my riv nut gun and rivet this in. Alright, so I got this one riveted in. It's very simple how I use this gun. I'm not going to go into full detail on how to use this specific gun. There's multiple different styles out there. Essentially, you thread on your riv nut here. You put the riv nut in the hole, and then you're going to squish these two handles together. And it's going to clamp that riv nut on there, and then you just unthread it out by pulling this rod at the bottom. Alright, I bolted this flare on with just one hole. I had to drill out that pilot hole to a little bit larger than a 1/4 inch because I'm using 1/4 inch bolts. These flares will flex a little bit, so when you go to press it up against the fender, you'll notice that one side is kind of higher than you need it to, but you can kind of pull them together slightly and they'll fit exactly where you want them. So I need 2 hands to do this, but I'm going to pull them together and then I'm going to mark the rest of the holes. Alright, so I just drilled out all the pilot holes, except for the last one. That one's offset a little bit differently, so I'll make sure to get that one right after I bolt it on again. Mark it, take it all off, put the new threaded insert in. But doing that, making your mark after putting one in, should line these holes up perfectly to where when you put your flare up against it, you shouldn't have any alignment issues with your holes and your threads. All right, so they all went on extremely well. Zero fitting issues. Every bolt went right in and aligned perfectly. And you can just see now how perfect, I mean, this really follows the Fender. So you can run a welting strip through here. It does help with water splashing up through, and you know, sometimes you get water spots on like a dirty, wet road. But if you plan on not driving in the rain, you could actually not run a welting strip because it is so close up to the body. You can't really tell that, you know, there's any gaps or anything like that. So that's another reason why I like these flares. Another tip when you're fitting these flares, say you go paint them and you're going to put them on again, make sure that you don't tighten each bolt down. It's kind of common sense, but leave the bolts a little bit loose. That way you have a little bit of movement to just make sure your bolt fits in there a little bit easier. All right, so that flare is in. It's about right where a typical G-nose S30 Fender flare would sit. Its gaps look perfect. Everything fit perfect. No stress on the Fender flare also. And that's another thing too, you don't want to bend these too much. Latch them down, it could cause cracks. So this one was installed with no stress on that flare whatsoever. So I'm gonna go around. I'm gonna get the other flare done on that side. We're gonna work on showing you guys how we cut these flares, and then after that, we'll start working on the back. These are a little bit more involved. Since this is like a double layer of metal, you have to actually pinch the metal down and weld that seam shut. So we'll get to that. First thing first, we'll finish the fronts and then head on to the back. All right, both front flares are mounted. We're gonna move on to the backs. All right, so the placement of the rear flare, and just like the front, this is gonna be really up to how low you want the car, what size wheels you're running. And you know, because basically if you're running a 18-inch wheel, which some of these Z guys do run, plus your tire tread width of the sidewall, you're possibly going to be cutting into your car quite a bit. You know, you're going to be raising that flare quite a bit to make sure your car doesn't look like it's a 4x4 up, you know, driving down the road. So since I'm familiar with my buddy's, you know, type of wheel choice he has and the ride height he's going to be running, I put these almost in the stock location also as a normal ZG body. And how I determine that, just from looking at a lot of pictures, is I like to get the front of the flare right at that body line, slightly above it. I follow this body line with where my bolts are going. So I like to place this first bolt under the body line, the second bolt right above the body line. So if you follow that body line, that middle bolt is going to go right above it. Keep following the body line, that's going to go right under it. And that pretty much will get your front of the flare in that position. And what I noticed also is the last bolt should line up with the end of the bumper. And this flare has to be kind of pulled in together like the front flare, just slightly. So you will flex it a little bit when you actually go to install it. But yeah, if I quickly line it up to that orientation, it's gonna look something like that. Just flexed in a little bit more, so you won't see, you know, the original body right here as much. All right, so Scarlett installed these flares perfect. I taught her well. So everything follows great. This body line right here is going to be right at or above this first bolt. And then, like I said previously, I like to have this bolt above the body line. This bolt will match up with the end of this bumper. This bumper is kind of lopsided right now. It wasn't installed correctly. But when that's leveled out, that bolt should end right in the middle of this. And this front tip ends right on top of this body line. So super happy. Once the car is going to get cut and welded next, I'll show you guys the steps for that. But once this car is lowered, which it is on coilover, so it will be lowered, it should be a perfect fitment. Starting on this side, looks like whoever was doing body work to this rear panel took the body line out right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a straight line or straight edge. I can still kind of see it right here. I know that it's right under this fuel door. This fuel door right here is where the body line starts. So I'm going to take a straight edge and I'm just going to trace with a pencil. That way I can put the flare on, and then when future body work is done, they can recreate that line. All right, so that's about where the body line will be. So I'm going to mark my holes based off of the bottom of this tape line. All right, so before I put the rib nuts in here, I just kind of wanted to show you exactly what I meant by kind of pulling them, the flares in a little bit before you mark it. You can see naturally right here how it lays is not in the correct position, but if you pull it in slightly, that's where you would typically want it. One thing that I didn't mention is the hardware I use are these Allen key button head screws. This is a 1/4 inch by 20 thread, and I believe they're 3/4 long, and then obviously a stainless steel washer as well. Everything's stainless steel. And then for the rib nuts, it's a 1/4 inch by 20 thread rib nut as well. And these are a zinc coated rib nut. You could get aluminum rib nut, you can get a plain steel rib nut, possibly stainless steel rib nuts. One thing you just want to make sure is you get the correct material rib nut for whatever material you're putting it on. If you do like an aluminum against a steel, you could get a corrosive problem later on due to the materials of aluminum on top of steel. All right, so that's the last flare installed. Give you a walk around of what it looks like. The next thing that we do when we go to cut these flares, and this goes for all 4 flares, I'm going to trace the outline of the flare, remove the flare, and then about 1 to 1.5 inches, somewhere between 1 and 2 inches, I'm going to draw another line in parallel with the line we traced, and that's going to be our cut line. That's going to be exactly where we actually cut the metal out, and it's going to be below, obviously below the rib nuts. Front, that's going to be the one step you do for the fronts, and then they're done. For the back, you got to be careful not to cut through the second layer. We're going to leave that second layer, and I'll show you what we do when we get to that point, but we're going to actually weld the 2 layers together and then finish cutting off the second layer. All right, so we got my outside line. That's the actual trace of the fender flare. And then we went about 1.25 inches down, and I made little ticks 1.25 inches down everywhere across the line, and then I sketched the line that I'll be cutting with an angle grinder. And I'll show you guys how to get a really nice smooth cut with a regular 4.5 inch angle grinder. We got the angle grinder ready, 4.5 inch disc. I like to use the thinnest disc you can find. It helps cut through metal a lot more clean, and also it's more of a cutting disc than a grinding disc. So when you're starting at your line, you're not going to want to cut through the metal all the way just yet when you start. You want to trace the outside of your line with the angle grinder over and over again. And what's that going to do? It's going to slowly cut through the metal until your last pass, it's going to be a lot more controllable and a clean line when you cut through finally. So I'm going to start and just slowly follow the outside of this line with light pressure. All right, I just got done doing my first pass. I didn't go all the way through the metal. It's probably going to take 2 or 3 more passes, and eventually we'll be able to cut that whole thing off. All right, so here it is right after chopping it off. I didn't clean up the edge at all, but you can see how it's a pretty clean, straight line just by using a angle grinder. I didn't use any body saw or anything, you know, fancy, but as long as you take your time and be a little, you know, methodical with it, you will get a nice clean line, and without any accidents happening at the same time, like going off into the fender. Just take your time with it and you'll get it looking really good. I got the back line traced where I need to cut. Same thing as the front. You want to make sure that you don't cut through the second layer. So you're going to take your time and go over the line several times until you cut through. When you do start cutting through this, you're going to notice there's like a tar, almost like a seam sealer substance that is in between these two panels. It's probably, you know, to make it waterproof, but you are going to notice that it comes out and it melts. Once we get this outer skin off, we'll clean all that up so we can have a weldable surface. Also, once you break through this, you're going to need to pry this outer skin off, and you're going to be bending the metal a little bit. You just want to avoid any deformation of this side of the cut. Okay, here's what I was talking about. I went ahead and cut the pinch weld out just to make it easier to strip the outer layer off quickly to show you guys what's going on in here. This is the outer layer skin. This is the inner layer skin of the wheel well. Sometimes what you could do, which I'm not sure if I'll have to do it this time around, but depending on how far up you cut this, the gap between the two panels gets larger. And an easy way to fill that gap is using a metal rod shoved between the two pieces of metal, and you can weld that rod to both pieces of you know, sheet metal. Where I have this cut going, it looks like I will be close enough to where I can tack weld the two pieces of metal together and not have to use that metal rod. But I'm going to clean this up first. I'm going to try to get all this tar off and get, you know, clean metal on both sides, and then I'll determine whether or not I have to use that fill rod or if I'm able to just tack weld the two pieces of sheet metal together. So we'll get this cleaned up and we'll get right back to you. All right, so I got the area cleaned up. It looks like I will need the fill bar right in this area because the seam sealer is so thick in here that the two panels won't close together. But it does look perfect to tack right in this area, as well as down here once, you know, I get to a certain point. But I'll probably trim that bar to right about here, and we'll weld it in right along this edge. All right, we got everything cleaned up. Welder's set up. This is probably going to be the most important step, but each time you're welding your tacks, you're not going to do full beads of welds on this. You will warp this panel, and it can be severely warped. When you go to tack your welds, keep your air gun in hand at the same time, and you're going to spot blast air onto that weld to cool it off, you know, rapidly. You want to cool down that weld as fast as you can, because if you tack several welds in the same spot, that heat is going to transfer through this panel and it really will warp it extremely bad. One more thing before you start welding is these back panels, you're going to want to take them out, or at least have them visible to look behind, because if you see any smoke, more than likely it's a fire, and you want to have your hose on standby for any type of extinguishing you need to do if any fires. All right, so we got the metal rod in right where we wanted it. We started tacking it, blowing air, compressed air onto each tack as we weld. I like to feel the surface also, just to make sure it's not getting hot. And you can touch it. If you can't touch it, it's probably too hot. But all I did was the exterior skin onto the rod first, and now I'm going to slightly pull on the inner sheet metal and tack it along the edge there as well. This all came out to be pretty close to where I can just pinch weld all those together right into the seam. So we'll get to it. Got a few more tacks on it. Gonna keep on going. all pretty much welded in. I'm gonna work on putting more tacks through here. It's just loaded with that seam sealer in there and it's contaminating my welds and being a pain in the butt. But I'm gonna finish that up and then I'm gonna trim this little lip off that I left over and sand down these welds. I'm not gonna sand these down all the way flush with the outer skin. I don't want to introduce, you know, a whole bunch of heat into it and risk warping it after taking all that time spot welding. But this is going to get seam sealer all the way through as well, so there's no point in making this absolutely perfect. But I'm going to get to that. All welded in, trimmed up. Now I'm going to take this flapper disc and I'm going to go around and just kind of knock down a lot of these high points and smooth it out to the best I can without too much heat getting into it. It's grinded down right where I want it. I'm gonna now DA it with some 80 grit just to get rid of any of this flaking paint. I'm gonna tape it off and then I'm gonna spray this protective high performance enamel over the bare metal. And then we'll put seam sealer over that. I'll let that dry for about an hour and then I'll come back and tape it off and seam seal it. All right, I got it taped off. Just put the seam sealer on. I'm gonna try to pull this tape off while it's still wet and hopefully it'll give me a clean line. All right, there we go. So the last thing to do this car is to put the flare back on. We got to tackle the other side, which is just going to be an exact repeat of how to do this rear. When the client gets the car, they're going to lower it to how they want it, and we're going to leave it at this height so that way they can load it onto their trailer easily. But yep, that's how you install flares correctly on an S30 chassis, and really you can take what you learn from this video and apply it to any other car. That's going to be it for this video. In the next videos, you're probably going to see more military content. Definitely going to see more work done on my Z. I have already started the body work on it. Just really deciding on how much I want to do before I put the suspension on it and get it on the ground. I'm ready to get this rotisserie off this car and just set this thing on the ground. It's going to probably be a totally different perspective since it's been up in the air for over a year now. But anyways, if you like watching this type of content, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.